Hello, thank you for your invitation. So I'm Isabelle Arvers at Arles Jeux Video. I'm the curator. And I would like to encourage you to go and look at my website, isabellearvers.com, because what I'm going to talk to you about today is a link to a project that I've been managing for the past 3 years. It's the world tour of art and video games. It is a project that I initiated in countries from the south 3 years ago with a focus on women's practices, queer and so today I'm going to talk to you about diversity in video games, but what I'm going to talk to you about is strongly related to this project which I am continuing to host. I will be in Morocco for a new step of the world tour in November and then in Cameroon in December. I just wanted to begin with that. So, to begin with, and I'm delighted that there is a former game in the room, and I didn't know, but what I'm going to show you, I'm going to actually take the sound out and I'll put it back on afterwards. So, what I'm going to show you is my first film, which is called Eyes and Other. And this was a request from the Gamers Festival to present films made from video game engines. And this exhibition took an interest in the question of identity and alterity in video games. And the question I was asking, so it was in 2012, and those subjects are talked about a lot more in Europe and in the United States now, but it is fairly recent. And at the time, I was wondering why the other was always an evil guy, a terrorist, an enemy. And I was wondering why we couldn't have more collaboration and cooperation in video games. So we're going to build around us all of the fictions that we are going to, the stories we're going to tell and that will write our history. So what I was explaining, and I was presenting myself as a black man because that's how I see myself on the inside for different reasons. What I'm trying to explain is what that our foundations today are based on all of the stories we can tell about ourselves. So that is the introduction. So because I'm going to talk about inclusion and diversity in video games, I'm going to give you a quick reminder. These questions were looked at in depth by scholars and have been for a number of years now. And this allowed us to demonstrate that even though the representations were maybe not stereotyped or not necessarily well represented, these representations did exist and had existed for a number of years, with either what we call non-gaming characters in the games that were mentioned just before the mainstream games, or in characters. But there were very few heroes or main characters that represented this diversity. Until Dontnod, which is a French video game studio, brought out Tell Me Why, within which one of the two protagonists is transgender. And what's interesting for this game is that there is a lot of attention paid to avoid stereotyping this question of trans identity. And the studio worked extensively with an association to avoid quite a lot of traps which are often related to this representation. So I'm going to quote a person who should have been with me today, Rumpel, who is an Argentinian game developer and also a journalist, and who writes a blog that I do recommend that you look at, but it's in Spanish. It's called Metajuegos. And she's a non-binary game developer and feminist. And she wrote an article called Don't Bury Your Gaze. So I'm going to give a bit of context to you here. Rumpel is talking about these two codes, the Hays Code and the Comics Code Authority, which define the moral standards for the film industry and for comics, but which actually continued to sustain, although they're not really applied, but continued to sustain and influence the production of digital texts. And even though there was a representation of, let's say, queer communities, there was often a problem because although the character was present, things didn't go well for them in the game. And so that's why Rumpel wrote this article, Don't Bury Your Gaze, because if we want to talk about representation, we must really analyze how they're presented and what is the message that we wish to convey. And so this is a little dated also. This is a project which I think came out at the end of the 2000s. It's Anna Entropy, called Dysphoria. And I showed within the framework of gamers because at the time you allowed me to create an exhibition of a compilation called the Pirate Card. The Pirate Card, which was a compilation of games by mostly American developers of the time, and this included practically 1,000 games, and we exhibited them in an art gallery with 3 computers connected to projectors so that people could play different games. And it also allowed us to change people's relationship with games. And in this compilation, there were Anna Entropy's games, and that's how I became acquainted with her work. And I would like to underline this book, which I believe should be a Bible, which is called Rise of the Video Game. Sinisters, because most of the researchers and also the curators talked about the misrepresentation and a stereotyped representation. And the idea is that maybe we should stop letting the gamers not allow them to press the gay button, but actually promote and show games that are made by an increasing number of people and which will allow us to have different types of narratives, different aesthetics. And therefore, Anna Entropy encourages everybody to create games, saying that, and she says that the more we have a variety of different people who create the games, the more we will avoid having this mainstream side of things with only one type of aesthetics. I find hyper-realism very tiring. We know that it required a lot of resources. But I think it's important to take an interest to all of those who produce content. And what you can see on the video here is her game Dysphoria, which tells the story of her transition. And at the time, it was not necessarily a subject that was freely talked about. And so I really do believe that this book is a true Bible. So now I'm going to talk to you about the projects that I have encountered during my travels. Whilst I was taking an interest in those who produce content and who reappropriate the narratives on their own persons and who change or not the representations by becoming their own initiators of their own narrative. So a game that I presented in an exhibition called Game Reflections in 2013, I believe, by Merit Kopas. This was a sort of an alternative to Punk is Not Dead. And it consisted in hugging others. And I showed the film and the reflection I had on the need to maybe work in cooperation and collaboration and having a caring approach. And this is why I began with the Hug Punks game by Merit Kopas. And when I was in Brazil on my art and game video world tour, I met Renata Ropia, who is the initiative of the Women Game Jam, which took place in all of Latin America, and she coordinates. Or at least 2 or 3 years ago, she was coordinating things. Maybe my information is out of date. And during a game jam, she created, with some friends, a game called Coming Out Simulator. And when we talked about the organization of this women's game jam, we also talked about the questions of inclusivity. Why? Because you know that in certain feminist settings, it tends to exclude a lot of people because, for example, we refuse transgender people. And which I believe is extremely problematic because, normally speaking, we should all pull together and not be fighting against each other. So Renata explained that people were paying a lot of attention to this question so that they were as inclusive as possible. And because I was talking about Rumpel earlier on, Rumpel also created a lesbian simulation game which aims to promote a non-binary and non-discriminating society. So I do encourage you to go onto her each account and to play Kiss the Girl. She also designed quite a few feminist games related, for example, to the law on abortion, because at the time when I went to Argentina, the abortion law had not yet been, the right to abortion law had not yet been voted. So whilst I was traveling around the world, I tried to work with local artists and with communities. For example, I put an example of a workshop that I held, machinima in the Trans Foundation, where I worked with sex workers in Bogota, and who said that they could use the EMA machines to document police violence towards trans people. So that was a potential example of collaboration and exchange. And I also took an interest in the question of feminism, but also gender and identity in other belief systems, because I'm doing a thesis on decolonization in the art of video games. So when we raise this question of decolonization, we're looking at what came before the colonies, and in particular before, there were other beliefs. And on the question of gender, wherever I went, be it in Southeast Asia or Latin America, and now a lot in Africa, because over the past 2 years I've been traveling above all in Africa, it so happens that the perception of gender is entirely different in the animist belief systems. And moreover, there are other perceptions and other interspecies human non human imaginations. And this, of course, has an impact on gameplay. I already talked about the question of care, and I will come back to other aspects later on. So, I can maybe start showing you some examples of games that I met during my travels, no longer home by the Humble Grow duo. In this game, which is a sort of an autobiographical game, it seeks to show everyday life. And so to approach, but in a very light-hearted manner, the queer question. Because in this game, it talks about the difficulties that we have at the end of a moment. And here it was, they were going to leave school, and they were flatmates. They were all going to part company. And this is all about the question of depression, subjects that are not very often part of video games, although we are beginning to see it. So this question of the queer identity is approached through the use of the they pronoun. And there was the will not to stigmatize or stereotype, but just to show the daily life whilst evoking this question. And what you can see behind me is the representation of these moments of depression. In Japan, I also met NP, I think she's called MP, who works under a pseudonym, who proposes visual novels, which is a very widespread genre in Japan. And she tries to reappropriate real events that took place, for example, in Tokyo. In particular, a trans woman who was not allowed into a hot spring. And what NP wanted to do was to revisit this story in a positive manner. And what if things had gone well? And so she proposes another type of world. When I was in Thailand, I was lucky enough to interview the people from the Roger Films channel, which I do recommend. Of course, I don't speak fluent Thai. Maybe you don't either, but it's really interesting to follow. So this is a queer video game channel which states that we can be different and be a good gamer. Once again, it might seem simple when you look at it like that, but it's actually not that obvious. When I was in Korea, I also interviewed feminist people who once again gave their testimonies anonymously, where things are far more tricky. But I do really recommend that you go and look at this YouTube channel, and I think it's also available on Facebook. And the aesthetics, I think, are really interesting as well. In Brazil, I met a collective, and at the time it was a collective of students at the Morumbi University that was working on a game called Florescer. The purpose being to allow people to better understand the life of a transgender teenager. And to do this, they worked with a I guess we could say a trans sex workers house uh, to avoid stereotypes, but also to show their daily lives and not to um, make it banal, but rather, I, 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 the idea is to uh, really to get people to think about things. So it's not necessarily a very joyful game because there are times when, in the face of a very binary world, this teenager comes up against certain problems. So just afterwards, when I met them, the same collective was working on another game called Bia, and they really, with this game, wanted to get out of this idea of stigmatization and just make it a game with a, a game player that it's easy to recognize, but which aims to fight against gender stereotype. You see, pink and blue. And this game is. I tested the beta test version last month, and it's a game designed by a studio in Berlin, but whose founder was from Ghana and now spends their time between Ghana and Berlin, called the Ouagadougou Chronicles, which is entirely based on African mythology. And so, which borrows from a lot of cosmogonies from mostly Western Africa. And they really tried to work on the question of gender by referring to the fact that what we often hear, the prevalent discourse in West Africa, is that homosexuality is a Western import and something that the West is trying to impose upon Africa. But it so happens that actually that's not true. That, of course, this was present beforehand. And this game refers to what is present. So, for example, in the Yoruba language, and if you want to read it, this is a book which is entitled The Invention of Women. And it so happens that in the Yoruba language, there is no feminine or masculine. And this, of course, has an impact on education and on the perception of things. Therefore, it's very important to remember what was present before Islamism or Christianism. So, what also captured my interest in terms of representation and reappropriation of images and one's identity and history is the question of the representation of human bodies. When I was in Kenya, I interviewed Agnes Endewa, who is working on a game called Lika the Journey, and which attempts to make people aware of the condition of women, first of all among the Maasais, but also throughout the rest of Africa, and which broaches the question of excision. So also in terms of the representation of women, or the fact of taking a woman as the heroine of a game, which once again is not that customary. Where here we're not in West Africa, but we are now in Madagascar. The Dahalo game it is taking an interest in a fact that is currently ruining the south of Madagascar, and that is the question of zebu thieves. That's how it began, but it's actually turned into a civil war. And when I asked them why they'd chosen a woman as their main character, they said that most of the men are now dead, and today it is the women who are defending the villages. Therefore, this game talks about this question. But when I talk with the team, there are 4 of them with the will to make a triple A. Of course, that was complicated, and it was not very well perceived by the public because there are defects, there are bugs. But yet, when I interviewed them, they told me that they had really paid careful attention to the feminine characters because they didn't want to over sexualize the body or its representation. Now, this takes us to another type of question, which is how can we rewrite our own history or story? How can we use video games to show and document things that were remained invisible for during colonization? And there is an African proverb which says that until lions have their own historians, the history of hunting cannot claim the glory of the hunter. And so this is a production of a studio Kaifu in Senegal, and the game bases its entire narrative on Sera cosmology. That Sera is one of the founding peoples of Senegal. And they have a great deal of knowledge of the stars, so all of the gameplay is based on this knowledge. In Ghana, once again, so I'm traveling up and down, the Letty Art Studio is one of the first studios on the African continent, and Ewam Tyra, who is the creator of Letty Arts, was a Marvel fan, a comics fan. But one day he said, well, what if we had our own heroes? So, for example, we're familiar with Spider-Man. Well, in the Ashantis people, there is a character called Ananse, I believe. I don't want to make a mistake because it's not written on my notes, but which is a character that is represented as a spider. So the idea is to make these different cultures better known. So it's more of a Pan-African game because we find heroes that are close to the Maasai culture or the Ashanti culture or the Dogon culture. But for example, I just chose this slide because we often talk about the wax which I'm wearing, which is not African at all, whereas the kente that the hero is dressed in is a true embroidered material that comes from Ghana. So it's truly African. So to close, a few solutions, a few possibilities to introduce greater inclusion and diversity in video games. Well, it is already the case, once again, of course, here, except that very often it's almost a bit like greenwashing. As soon as there's a whiff of scandal in terms of inclusion or diversity, strangely, just afterwards there is a unit that is set up on diversity and inclusion in the major studios. Unfortunately, it comes just after scandals, but well, at least it is there. So when I was in Brazil, I was talking with Renata. She said that in most of the major independent studios in Sao Paulo, There are advisory committees to prevent any discrimination within the studio. So that is a possibility. There is an investment fund for greater diversity that was created called Wings, and those who can could potentially invest. And for a very long time, I am a very, very small dot in the universe, but been fighting so that games can be used as a learning tool. And on that topic, I suggest that you look at a meeting I had with Audrey Tang, who is Ministry of Digital Affairs in Taiwan, and who also, for example, translated Nikki Case's game, Coming Out Simulator. And in the interview that I had with Uzbek Erica, Audrey's talking mainly about all of the efforts undertaken in Taiwan to use video games as a learning tool. And I will end on that point. And it's the first time that I saw neutral toilets, and it did a lot of good. Well done, Isabelle. Thank you. Very good. Fantastic. So I'm taking back for half an hour. Maybe you can stay for 2 minutes if we have a couple of questions from the audience for Isabelle. What is the AAA? Micro, s'il vous plaît. Micro. So, for example, you will find Call of Duty, FIFA. These are games which are, in terms of visual quality and technical quality, tick all of the A's. And millions were invested to produce them, and they're played throughout the world. They're very mainstream, widespread games that dominate the market. Fortnite, for example. So yes, I come from the video game industry, and we consider the AAAs from $20-30 million of investment. So if you have $20 or $30 million to invest in your cultural production, you can create a AAA work of art. But so far, nobody's actually managed to do that. And the Halo game with 4 people had the desire of actually creating this type of game with the idea of giving a percentage of their profits to the village in the south of Madagascar. So there was this desire to, work for a political cause. Well, I note your intention and what Arne was saying earlier on. The concern, this question of hyper-realism is already engaged in a trajectory, and it's part of a discourse. I find it very interesting to multiply the forms and the levels of accessibility. We saw very retro games, very simple in our exhibitions. We have Anthony fans who created mini games in a few days or a few weeks, but which allow people to be emotionally far more convincing than very costly games. And when you pay attention to the emotional content, the realism of the pictures, the definition of these virtual worlds doesn't really matter. It's very important that we create games, and that we create games at school, that we play at school, so that we can take a step back with regard to these. Well, what a brilliant transition with Marie.